Welcome back to another episode of the Quarantine Diaries, day 37. And it's Trivia Tuesday, so we're going to hear our Trivia Tuesday question in just a moment. We're continuing to talk about the book of Judges this week, and Jared Kelly yesterday gave us a great introduction to the book. And so our Trivia Tuesday question has a little bit to do with that. And if you've done your reading, you should know at least one of these, and hopefully you know a few more. But let's go ahead and hear our Trivia Tuesday question. Today's Trivia Tuesday question: how many births in Scripture are foretold by angels? And who are those characters that are foretold by angels? So how many and who are those characters whose births are foretold by angels? There's a part two of the question. If you hear the term biblical number, what is the first number that comes to mind? Biblical number. What was that first number you just thought of? Email your answers to jared@meridianwoods.org and we'll reveal those winners on Friday. Next up, let's hear our verse of the week. Now, this week's verse is a very popular verse, Psalm 23, so I want to put a challenge out there. Last week, the Sunday Boy quoted our verse of the week from memory, James 1:2-8. If you can quote Psalm 23 from memory, we would love to hear you say that on the show. So email me at jared@meridianwoods.org, and we would love to hear that. So let's hear our verse of the week. This week's verse of the week is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So here David, who's a shepherd himself, is describing God as a shepherd of his life and leading him through all these things. Remember, we talked about David and all the things that he accomplishes and God does through him. I think in the book of Judges, this idea of the Lord as a shepherd is put on full display almost more than any other book. Remember, 40-ish years before this, they've just been rescued from Egypt. God's brought them out where they were slaves. And so they don't really have much wealth of their own. They're not traders. They don't have agriculture and crops. They don't really have much livestock except for the essentials that they need. They don't have a military. And so God is literally shepherding these people like a flock through the wilderness. And when they come to the promised land, he uses these judges and empowers these men and women of faith to accomplish these incredible things. And Samson is one of the most fascinating, complex characters in the entire Bible. And so we're going to spend today and tomorrow looking at Samson. Sometimes when we read scripture as Christians, we know the end of the story and we have the end in mind. And sometimes it's lost on us just how incredible some of these stories are. Right up to the moment of disaster, all of the things God has been building up, and then it kind of just falls onto one person being faithful and being in stride with what God has planned and rescues them from sudden death and from the whole thing falling apart. And it's an epic account. When we read about Samson, he has some incredible stories. I'm a fan of literature, and sometimes when you're reading a good book, you kind of just have to sit back when you finish a chapter and just kind of stare off out the window and think about and reflect on what you've just read. And this happens a lot in Samson's life. I just want to look at one little account today, and I want to encourage you to reread 13, 14, 15, and 16, the story of Samson in Judges again, and just pick out some of these moments to reflect on. In chapter 15, we get this account of Samson taking vengeance on the Philistines. And there's a lot of complexities to this story and what has led up to these moments. But I just want you to think about and consider this. In verse 3 of chapter 15, Samson said to them, "This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them." So he went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. Then he fashioned a torch to each pair of tails, lit the torches, and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the stalks and the standing grain, together with vineyards and olive groves. So let's consider this story for a second. I want you to imagine going out and getting 300 of any animal. Maybe 300 ants. I could probably find 300 earthworms if I had to, but let alone one fox. How would you capture that fox? You know, if you gave me a week, I don't know if I could trap a fox, let alone 300, let alone tie them together. So time and time again throughout the story of Samson, we see him using these incredible feats of strength to accomplish things. And we're going to continue to compare and contrast these Old Testament characters and their successes and their failures and how Christ fulfills those things. And ultimately, God brings all of those things together in the end through Christ. And so I want you to consider the idea of meekness. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, remember, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And one thing that Samson lacks in his life is meekness. A good way to think of meekness is strength under control. We think about a horse. If you ride a horse, you know, this animal is so much stronger than a human, but we've trained them, and this is a strength that is for a time and a place and a purpose. And Samson sometimes lacks that meekness and having his strength under control and trusting God to use it in his time frame and to use it for his will. And so consider that, reread the story of Samson. Pick out some of these things to reflect on, and we will continue to talk about Samson tomorrow. Hope you have a great day. See you later.